Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just DAO It, the podcast for people starting DAOs. Today is a really exciting episode because we are doing a new series of episodes with lawyers and corporate service providers. And today we have the leading Marshall Islands DAO lawyer, Tatyana Cerullo, on the show. Really happy to have you here. These episodes will be a little bit different. You know, in a normal episode, as people know, we do recent DAO news, and then we do kind of an in-depth interview with someone where we talk about more like starting DAOs from a founder perspective, and in terms of what's it like and what software are you using and how do you approach, you know, the social element. And today we're going to focus more on the legal and corporate side, and hopefully people enjoy this. So welcome to the show, Tatyana.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yep, absolutely. So today should be a lot of fun. We're going to do some general questions I think will be really useful for people. We'll talk a little bit about Tatyana's background in the space. We want to dig into what makes a DAO from a legal perspective and a corporate perspective, as opposed to more from the social perspective. We'll talk a little bit about general legal and corporate knowledge that we think people should have when they're starting DAOs, especially as it relates to your legal form and legal issues and legal entities. And we'll talk about what's new in the world of DAO legal, what's coming. And then finally, a couple special topics for this show. We're going to talk about DAO LLC operating agreements. And that's a topic that's, I think, really relevant to especially a lot of MIDAO's clients or people that are doing DAO LLCs in the Marshall Islands. And we will also talk about a recent controversial post on X from famous lawyer, crypto lawyer, Gabe Shapiro, who is now a MIDAO competitor and has been doing a little bit of shit posting. So we want to address one of his recent controversial tweets. Just a disclaimer, and I may repeat this at the end. Of course, nothing on the show is legal advice or financial advice or tax advice or any kind of professional service advice. There's really important reasons why people give these disclaimers. It's not just to let ourselves off the hook, but it's because when you engage a lawyer yourself, they're going to understand everything about your particular situation and give you advice that's tailored to your specific needs. On a show like this, there's just no way to do that, right? We're giving general education and general advice that might apply broadly, but not specifically. So not legal advice. So let's dive in. Tatyana, first of all, would you tell us a bit about your experience as a lawyer in general and how you got into serving DAOs?
Yeah, sure. So I am an attorney of 25 years. I'm licensed to practice in New York and Hawaii. In the last 16 years, I got licensed to practice in the Marshall Islands. And 16 years ago, I was first introduced to the Marshall Islands through a company I was working for as general counsel. They were an international engineering firm doing projects all over the Pacific, including the Marshall Islands. And the president of the company wanted me to be licensed there. And so I got to meet a lot of the sort of politicians, legislators, and also the king of the Marshall Islands at the time. And I also met his attorney, who is turning 90 next year. He has been around since the trust territory days, and I can explain what that means in a bit, but he's been around, and he took me under his wing and mentored me and helped me get licensed in the Marshall Islands. So my first exposure was working with the king and working on some domestic issues. I helped write some legislation back then, and was working on contracts and different matters. But then I realized quickly that the Marshall Islands has a huge corporate and maritime registry for traditional companies. The association laws in the Marshall Islands were passed in 1990. So we're going on over 40 years of strong, established corporate laws in the Marshall Islands. And they happen to be modeled after US law. So I just want to step back a bit and go back to what is this U.S. trust territory? So this happened after World War II. Some of the Japanese territories in the Pacific were taken over by the U.S. And so the U.S. influenced how it developed its legal system and judiciary. And so when the Marshall Islands gained its sovereignty as a totally independent nation in the 80s, it established all kinds of laws modeled after the US. Even though the US doesn't govern these laws or interpret these laws, the Marshall Islands governs its own internal domestic affairs and its own laws. So in the 90s, these corporate laws were passed. Since then, they've been updated and have been formed so that, or amended so that they are up to date with the most modern corporate frame or legal frameworks in the world. So we have an established corporate legal framework in the Marshall Islands. So being a U.S. trained attorney, I've worked for big law firms in New York City and also in Honolulu. I've worked as general counsel for public and private companies. I also was a federal law clerk in Hawaii. So using my US experience, I was able to sort of, transition into applying my experience into Marshall Islands law. So let me just tell you about the traditional corporate registry. It is a public-private registry that administers the corporate laws for non-resident companies. These are corporations that are totally traditional, no blockchain technology component at all. And they are all over the world. And they actually really have nothing to do with the Marshall Islands, except that they are registered there. And this other registry administers this registry and offers the services on behalf of the Marshall Islands government. So fast forwarding to DAOs and MIDAO and the Marshall Islands DAO registry, I first learned about it actually in 2021 because several clients had reached out to me, and after the 2021 Nonprofit Entities Act was passed, that allowed nonprofit entities to register as DAOs in the Marshall Islands. And I got some inquiries about this before I even knew that law had been passed. And I thought, wow, what is this all about? And I reached out to some legislators, and they kind of gave me a not very clear, explanation of what it was. And there was something in some news release in some social media that said, okay, there's this company, MIDAO, that is administering it. And I couldn't find anything about it, but it was because it was so new. It was just like seriously just in its infancy. And so I didn't know about it so much. And it just was dormant in my mind for a while until I realized that in 2022, an actual DAO Act was passed in the Marshall Islands, thanks to MIDAO. And I learned about this new entity where you could also have for-profits registering in the Marshall Islands. I reached out to MIDAO about this, and I quickly got very intrigued, feeling like, wow, this is the future of the world. This seems like an amazing option for this innovative corporate structure. And I started working hard to learn everything I could about it, already applying my knowledge of Marshall Islands law to DAOs. And now today I'm helping, I'm advising, I'm consulting, registering Marshall Islands DAOs, and also consulting with MIDAO.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So I want to just dig into a few of the things you said. First of all, you brought up a king. Is there still a king of the Marshall Islands? And if so, does
Yes.
he have any power over anything, or is it really a symbolic king?
No, that's a great question. So this king is called the Iroj Lap Lap, and he still exists. It sort of, the title is passed down through family. The original, or not the original, but the king that I knew and worked with through his attorney has passed away. But his brother is now the Iroj Lap Lap, and they do have power in the Marshall Islands over their own people. And there's a whole body of customary law that they sort of preside over. And there are traditional customary law courts there, but it's heavily influenced by what the Uroj Lap Lap thinks and says. So yeah, it's very much alive and well.
Does he
The
have
king,
power over corporate law in any way?
no,
Okay.
no. So
All right. That's the key that
it's just
people might be looking for here, because I don't
yeah,
think DAOs want to be ruled by a king. So that's
no,
good to
absolutely
hear.
not.
And so you mentioned that, Marshall Islands corporate law was based off of United States law. Isn't it in fact based off of Delaware law even? And so again, despite not being under Delaware or US jurisdiction, I think that's what makes it such a friendly jurisdiction for lawyers all over the world to work with, is that you pretty much know what you're dealing with because it's a lot like Delaware. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So the Limited Liability Company Act, which is what the Marshall Islands DAO LLC is based on, is modeled after Delaware. It's not exactly the same, but it's modeled after Delaware. So anyone familiar with US laws, Delaware law, will, recognize all the features there. What is
Yep.
really fantastic about what MIDAO has done in this new corporate or DAO registry is that the separate DAO Act carves out all of the laws relevant that are uniquely tailored for DAOs and using, blockchain technology to govern them.
Yep.
So there's specific provisions there addressing DAOs. So within the framework of the LLC Act, you have the DAO Act carving out exactly what DAOs need.
So, from your perspective as a lawyer, or another way of putting it, from a legal perspective, what makes a DAO a DAO? I mean, what makes a DAO different from any traditional organization?
Uh, in in my opinion, it's a DAO. Well, I guess you could talk generally or specifically to the Marshall Islands DAO LLC. Okay, so definitely it's how the DAO is governed that would give DAOs its characteristics. They tend to want to be more decentralized so that all members can participate in the community and have that transparency and reliability that we see with using blockchain technology. So it's also the legal wrapper that goes with it. And so Marshall Islands DAO LLCs are one option for this. You have, so a DAO is a community that usually is using blockchain technology, but in the Marshall Islands, you don't have to be using that, or you could start off not having that technology incorporated, but then grow into it. So that's also a benefit of the Marshall Islands DAO LLC. And then you have limited liability for your members. That's the idea of, in a legal perspective, if you have a DAO that is registered in a corporation, the idea is that you're protecting your members from
Yep.
liability. It's
Yeah.
like
Susan?
yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting to me because often when you ask someone who's working on DAOs to define what a DAO is, you kind of get answers in two different directions, right? One direction is more the social layer, like how do we operate day to day? Is there someone in charge or not? And to what degree? And to what extent are we extremely inclusive? and kind of open to in terms of our membership. There's that whole way of looking at it, but I think most of that is kind of separate from the legal and corporate structure. A DAO can choose to have a management team if they want to, I think, and still be a DAO, as long as they're doing certain things on the blockchain that traditional organizations do on paper. And so in particular, it's that membership tracking, using tokens, governance on the blockchain. But now, to your point, though, I mean, the legal form does not force you to do these things either. So, it's interesting to think about the DAO LLC legal entity. You can actually use it exactly like a traditional LLC if you want to. But then you have the option of tracking your members with a token and having anonymous membership, of not having managers if you don't want to, of, for example, governing open source software living on the blockchain, where in a traditional company, all your software is part of the company. And now with DAOs and DAO LLCs, you have this like open source software living separate from the company, even though you're governing it. So all these blockchain based things, as well as the governance structures, really, they're all optional. But having the DAO LLC legal entity allows you to do these things if and when you want to do them. Does that sound right?
Yes, exactly right. And that is also what makes the Marshall Islands DAO LLC so compelling and such a innovative, interesting fit for a lot of DAOs that don't really, want to have a centralized structure. So you can be centralized, or you can have a decentralized governance model.
So if you're starting a DAO today, just DAO It is still the podcast for people starting DAO. So if a founder is starting a DAO today, can you share just generally, I mean, what are the key legal issues that a founder of a DAO should be thinking about from the start?
Right. So just like, you have a business idea, whether it's, involving blockchain or not, you have a business idea, you really want to pursue this, you go and you register a company. Why? Because you don't want to be personally responsible for the liabilities of what you do as a company. So when you have a bunch of people who are enterprising towards a certain goal, and there's and money involved, most jurisdictions around the world are going to view you and all the people working with you as a partnership or just some group of people where you are all responsible for the liabilities of the company. So it's important, no matter what you're doing, to make sure that you're protecting yourself and your members by registering with some sort of jurisdiction around the world.
Yeah. And I would say too, I'd say money or other assets involved, even intangible assets, right? Like if there's intellectual property, such as software, even the name and logo of the company or other intellectual property, all of that is also at risk and creates liability for you if you don't have a legal form that clearly delineates who owns what property, what's owned by the company as opposed to the individual people. And so, and then taxes too, right? I mean, right out of the gate, if you don't have a legal form, you're kind of implicitly opting into the default tax treatment that any government might want to apply to you anywhere in the world, especially where the founders are based, rather than opting into a tax structure by creating a legal form yourself.
Yes, exactly. So you have a corporate personhood, you have a legal entity for tax purposes, and then you also have limited liability for your members.
Yeah. Are there any other issues that tend to come up very early on? I mean, aside from your legal form, are there things that always come up in the first conversation or two with DAOs that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when people are searching for the right legal entity, they're asking, can I issue a token? What are the laws in the Marshall Islands? Is it crypto friendly? Can we issue a token without a whole lot of red tape? How would it be treated by the Marshall Islands regulatory bodies? So those are things that come up. And what's great about the Marshall Islands DAO is that it's actually a perfect place for a DAO that wants to issue a token. It is crypto friendly. Um, you don't have the same scrutiny that you would get in the United States. So it's a non-US legal entity. And I mean, you can compare all the different jurisdictions, but a lot of clients, once I explain that to them, they're interested, because a lot of DAOs that would be registering in the United States are shy because of the unclear treatment of DAOs and tokens and whether they're considered securities or not. So they like the fact that the Marshall Islands DAO LLC is couched in this legal framework that allows for blockchain technology, celebrates it, you can use it, and it even has a provision that says nonprofits with tokens that are used for governance and utility purposes are not securities. It also adds that Marshall Islands, if the DAO is issuing to well, let me put it differently, sorry, to make it more clear. So the securities laws of the Marshall Islands just don't apply to these DAOs if they're issuing to non-Marshall Islands residents. So if you don't have any Marshall Islands residents who are involved in buying these tokens, then the Marshall Islands securities laws don't apply. So these are all very appealing points for a lot of clients when they first come to ask questions.
Yeah, makes sense. And it kind of leads me into my next question for you, which is what has happened recently in the world of policies affecting DAOs, laws, regulations, et cetera, really anywhere in the world. And one thing that comes to mind is, I think tokens are what a lot of regulators are kind of obsessed with at the moment, maybe for good reason, but I think they're generally doing bad things related to tokens. So like I can think of, in Europe, there's MiCA, which is this really long, complicated regulation associated with certain activities taking place in the EU. There's new VASP laws in the Cayman Islands and BVI, which were historically very popular for crypto projects, but now are scaring people away because the way the laws were written, that those countries can argue that you should be regulated as a VASP just because you launched a token, which is ridiculous. I think everyone, even in the in either TradFi or Web3, knows that the point of a VASP law or a virtual asset service provider is kind of to say, like, if you're custodying assets that belong to other people, you should have to follow special laws. Like if you're an FTX or a Kraken or a Binance or a Coinbase, right? Someone that like is telling me that you're holding my money, you should have to follow certain rules as far as transparency and auditing, allowing the government to make sure you're actually holding my money and not doing what FTX did, right? So like there's good reasons for some companies or DAOs to be regulated as VASPs, but to say that just because I launched and sold a token that represents governance rights or utility, that I should be considered a VASP is just crazy. And so, countries like that are pushing, companies away with these kind of ignorant laws. I think in the United States, there's at least been a lot of discussion about tokens. I don't know if I've seen any official government document or conversation yet around DAOs, but I mean, all these token and crypto related laws and regulations will still have implications for DAOs because they often do use tokens. So anyways, I mean, what are you seeing in the world? Is it the same stuff? Is it anything different in terms of, what's changing in terms of policies that might affect DAOs?
Let's see. Well, I think that a lot hasn't changed. Like the U.S. securities laws are still there. They're still unclear. There is the new DUNA law in Wyoming, and it looks that just went into effect July 1st, 2024. So it's very new. This is for decentralized unincorporated nonprofits. That Well, Wyoming is still in the United States, so they're not exempt from the U.S. securities laws. Which I don't know if maybe I take it for granted, being an attorney, U.S. trained attorney, but yeah, any jurisdiction in the United States that has some DAO friendly laws are still superseded by federal law. So there's no escape of the SEC and that really ambiguous treatment. To your points about the Virgin or BVIs and Cayman Islands, yeah, that is actually they're tightening the reins on the definition of VASPs and being more inclusive of projects, just because they are launching or issuing tokens. That's just not what the space needs. Like we need innovation. We don't want to stifle that. And I love that in the Marshall Islands. I've had clients say, well, this is what's going on in Caymans and BVI, and I don't want that. I want to be able to issue this token that is going to be our utility and governance token. And sure, it may add value. It may gain in value, but that wasn't what it was intended for. It's not meant to be a security. And so I need a jurisdiction that is going to support, us in this endeavor. So we have some clear guidance. And, we don't want to have to do KYC on every single, member who's participating. So that's the other thing. I mean, it just gets to be almost just so restrictive that you can't really become the amazing, enterprise that you're setting out to be. So you need the laws and the framework to work with you. Let's see, what else am I missing? Yeah, I mean, I guess, do you want to talk more about the DUNA or
Yeah, I mean,
some
I think
other?
that's a great one to bring up. I've been following closely, for one thing, a DAO called Nouns DAO, which is a leading DAO from the last couple of years, and the foundation. So this is a DAO that has a foundation, which rubs some people the wrong way because there's this board that's kind of in charge, but it's not entirely clear exactly how. But anyways, the foundation, basically came out with a report, announcing that they're planning on forming a DUNA, and let's talk about it. And so, I mean, even the channel to discuss the topic was called Nouns DUNA. So they were pretty set on DUNA from the start. MIDAO did engage in the conversation once the announcement was made to say, hey, maybe you should check out MIDAO as well. But, they were pretty set from the beginning on wanting to try this new thing. And I think one of the interesting reasons for their approach that can make sense in some situations was, and I've heard some others say this, not common, but some others have said the same thing, which is they said, look, our plan is to follow all of the US laws and pay all of the US taxes regardless, because we want to completely minimize the risk that there's any rule in the world that we're not following. And so if we're going to follow all the US laws and taxes and regulations anyways, we might as well register there. And I think it's an interesting argument, because most crypto projects say, well, we might not want to have to follow all the US laws and regulations. We don't want to pay the high US corporate tax rate. Maybe we want to, be taxed as a nonprofit somewhere in the world, like Marshall Islands or Cayman Islands. But in this case, this foundation is saying we're okay, because, by the way, the DUNA pays taxes as a for-profit. So I think a lot of people don't know that because it has nonprofit in the name. But, I was on the stage with one of the guys who wrote the law, and he confirmed that they're going to be taxed as for-profit. So I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, that if you have a lot of activity in the United States and you're planning on opting in to that legal nexus and following all the US rules anyways, well, that removes one of the downsides of creating your legal entity there, because you're already planning on opting into all those, what could be seen as downsides. So I think that's interesting. I think, to me, the other benefit of the DUNA, because certainly, in some situations it could be nice, is it's an unregistered entity. And there's also downsides to this, right? But that's in the name, unincorporated nonprofit association. You're not actually registering the company with the state, which means you get some of the legal benefits of a legal entity, such as liability protection, which is great, such as paying taxes collectively as a for-profit, which is better than having pass-through taxes on all the members, but still, means a high tax rate. And it allows you to, again, provide that liability protection to token holders. Now, if an unincorporated entity wants to go get a bank account or an exchange account, or maybe even, sign a contract with a third party, then it's going to depend on where in the world that third party is and whether or not they recognize unincorporated associations as legal entities with corporate personhood. And so, it's a much newer, novel, in some ways risky when it comes to some of these issues kind of approach. But I've said for a while now, and again, this is so new, we're all still learning about it. But if you're looking for a non-entity, like you don't want to have an organization, you just want to get that liability protection for your members. Again, you want to pay taxes, you want to opt into the US, okay, go for it. But if you're looking to have an organization, right, you want to have a decentralized organization with some purpose that's governing a protocol, that's building something together, whatever it is, that's when you want to look at a DAO LLC or some other legal entity for your DAO, as opposed to an unincorporated association. So that's kind of been my analysis, but I'd love to hear what your kind of latest thinking is on the DUNA as well.
Yeah, I think it's very limited. I think that if you are totally US based and you're a nonprofit, then sure, consider that. And also the other restriction that I thought was like, wow, is that you need at least 100 people to qualify, which, most of the DAOs that I've seen coming in to register are, well, not most, I mean, a good number are less than 100 members to start, and that is such a limiting requirement for a lot of DAOs. Also, why would you want to sign up to be a nonprofit but pay taxes anyways? It just doesn't make any sense when
it's a very US style concept, I think.
In the Marshall Islands, nonprofits are completely tax exempt. So, I mean, that seems like a better, it just seems like a better option. You can't have it can't be officially a for-profit, even though you're taxed on it in Wyoming. Like, there's just some things that don't make sense. Yeah, and like you said, you want to have an actual legal entity like a corporation or an LLC that is recognized around the world. I mean, you never, you want to be able to do business with third parties and other banks or other corporations, traditional finance, where, they see it, they know it, it's established. Yeah. So
yeah,
I think it could be a good fit for some, but it's not really the catch all that,
And especially, it's similar to my prior point. I mean, if you have to pick a legal entity in the United States for your DAO, maybe this is the one to pick now. I mean, there is still the DAO LLC in Wyoming, which is very limited compared to our DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. But I think either one of those entities is probably the best in the country. If, for example, all of your members and all of your business activity is in the United States, you're not generally allowed to go pick a legal entity elsewhere. You can't go to Cayman, you can't go to Switzerland, you can't go to Marshall Islands. It's really for global organizations where you do have membership and activity all over the world that you get to pick anywhere you want. And so if you're one of those DAOs, like you're focused on like Miami DAO or Austin DAO or whatever, and even in those cases, you might want to pick a local entity to your state, even if all your activity is in the state, even if there's no DAO specific entity for tax reasons or other reasons. But, at least the DUNA is there. And I'm excited to see Nouns experimenting with it. It's so new, maybe one day UNAs will be much bigger and more widely recognized than they are today, like LLCs are now after being created, 30 or 40 years ago. Right. All right. So what about what's coming next or what should be coming next? I mean, if you could write, and by the way, I mean, Tatyana and I both work on the laws in the Marshall Islands together. And so it's not just if you could write a law anywhere in the world, it's, we are writing laws somewhere in the world. But if you could write a law anywhere in the world, and if you want to talk about the Marshall Islands, that's fine. what needs to change to enable a stronger future for DAOs? And I have one idea, but I'll let you go first on this one.
So, okay, in the spirit of decentralized autonomous organizations, I mean, just the idea of community building and having people in the community have a say, I think is so important. And what MIDAO has done is MIDAO has invited leading Web3 lawyers from around the world to give their input. And I think this is so important. It's like, get people out in the field using these different entities and ask them, what is working, what doesn't work, what would you like to see, and just be so open to feedback, understand their feedback, and figure out what makes sense to add to the law. MIDAO and the Marshall Islands government wants to be at the top of the game always, and what that means is always inviting input and passing amendments to make sure that this DAO law is always at the cutting edge of legal entities for DAOs in the world. And of course, this is always balanced by having a legal entity and legal framework that is in line with international standards for dissuading criminals and bad actors, while balancing the innovations of these companies and what they need to thrive. So I think the Marshall Islands is really looking at that instead of just taking the iron fist approach, or just even ambiguous approach, trying to always walk that line. And I think that's really important for people to understand that this is an evolving structure and laws, but for the better and crypto friendly. And so yep. I think, okay, just to answer your question, just to like, what makes it stronger for the future is like taking in community input and always like not just passing laws that you think, or some law firm decides, oh yeah, pass this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. And I'll just add, from a non-Marshall Islands perspective, I think there's certain laws that apply based on where your company is formed, right? Like in the Marshall Islands or Cayman Islands or whatever. But then there are certain laws, in particular securities laws, and also parts of MICA or MiCA in the EU, that apply based on where you're selling what might be considered a security. So where you're selling your token, for example. And so these laws in the EU and the United States that relate to securities or related ideas are so damaging because they apply to you no matter where you form your company. If you want to sell a token to an American in America, you might be subject to those securities laws. And I think the way the US has handled securities laws, and maybe just because I see this firsthand living in the United States, it's just been awful. It's just this inconsistent treatment from regulators, the regulators' unwillingness to publish a rule, but rather just, they call it rulemaking through enforcement, which many consider unconstitutional. Congress's inability to get the regulators under control or pass their own law. And I think some new laws will be coming soon, especially with the new administration. But the idea, that selling a token in the United States might make that transaction considered a security and therefore put you under the grasp of the SEC is causing a lot of projects not to be willing to sell their token in the United States, and therefore missing out on one of the biggest markets in the world, or not be willing to sell their token in the EU and missing out on another one of the biggest markets in the world. And perhaps it's a slightly US centric view, because I want the United States to be involved in this innovation. I don't want people to skip the United States and, for us to miss out on this opportunity either. But I think those laws have to change. And, it's one of the things I've been exploring is, even though we're focused on the Marshall Islands, is there some way we can get involved in the United States and Europe to help push policy in the right direction? So I think that's another really important one. Let's turn to some of the feature topics for today. So the first one is I want to dig into DAO LLC operating agreements. So, when someone signs up with MIDAO and they say, yes, I want to create a legal entity in the Marshall Islands, one of the first things we do is we invite them to this onboarding portal, and we give them a template operating agreement for them to fill out. And today, this is, it's literally a Word document with all kinds of notes and blanks and choices. If you're this, choose A. If you're this, choose B. It's an amazing document that you've helped us create, Tatyana. So thank you. And it gives people just an enormous amount of context and optionality and flexibility, even without hiring a lawyer to get legal advice, although we still recommend that people do if they can. It's kind of like a LegalZoom or a Rocket Lawyer for people who are familiar with it. It's like a legal related service over the internet, in this case through a Word document that's not technically legal advice. And I was going through it recently, helping one of our DAO LLCs, think through some of the options. And, it's pretty complicated. A lot goes into this thing. You can see why people usually hire lawyers to help them with it. Could you just talk a little bit, Tatyana, about what is the purpose of the operating agreement for a DAO LLC? And generally speaking, how should people think about, how do you make these decisions? I mean, how do you choose what goes in it, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so an operating agreement is what they call the agreement between the members for a limited liability company. So the operating agreement template that MIDAO offers looks a lot like an operating agreement for a traditional company. It has all the elements of a traditional LLC, but it has the modern blockchain-based governance options there. So when you're going through it, obviously people who want to register have thought out kind of, what kind of DAO, what their mission is, their purpose, a bit about how they want to govern themselves, etc. So there's some questions around whether it would be a for-profit versus a nonprofit, and the template offers different language that would apply for for-profits versus nonprofits. There's also standard language in there that needs to be in there for just, to be in compliance with the law. So that's all covered in the template. And so in the agreement, it's for the members. It's for the members to know, how is this DAO going to be governed? And all the different, just like in a regular operating agreement. So yeah, and going back to like the origins of the LLC law, you'll see different requirements, like in any operating agreement, like record keeping, how is it managed? But in this template, there's, the option to be member managed or algorithmically managed, and also whether you want to have an option for having managers or like a council, like something akin to a board, or totally decentralized. And so all of those features are there, and optional language, depending on what you want or need, is offered. So you can decide what goes into your operating agreement.
Yep.
I'm trying to think,
And
am I missing something? Yeah.
Well, let me try to think about some of the common questions I get about it. So, first of all, just I think generally speaking, one way I like to tell people what the operating agreement is, yes, it's an agreement between the members, but it's also your way of telling the world who your company is, in a sense. So like, let's say, I know no one wants to end up in court, but if you end up in court or arbitration or a dispute, which is often where these agreements come into play, right? So everything's going fine. You don't necessarily need to look at your written agreement. But if you end up in court, the judge is going to want to know, well, who are the members of this company? And the judge or whoever is going to look at your operating agreement, and the operating agreement is going to say either the members are the people listed on Exhibit A, if it looks like a regular LLC, or it's going to say the members are the people who hold the token called whatever XYZ token on this blockchain at this address. And so that way the court knows who are actually the members of the company, or how the members know. But I think another example of that is, let's say the court wants to know, let's say you're in court and one member is saying, well, we decided we were going to spend $1 million on this thing. And someone else says, no, we didn't. This person took the $1 million and did something that they shouldn't have done with it because we did not agree we were going to do it. Okay, well, the judge or the jury will look at the operating agreement where it describes how decisions are made at the company. And the operating agreement, again, could say, well, we have, just like a normal LLC, we have to call a meeting, and you have to call the meeting 10 days in advance, and you have to notify people about the meeting. And then at the meeting, there's a quorum and blah, 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 right? You could say that. Or it could say, all the decisions related to this company are made by submitting proposals to the smart contract on this blockchain at this address and following the governance rules contained within that smart contract, right? And so now the court can go look at the smart contract and say, oh, well, on this smart contract, there was a proposal submitted which said we were going to spend $1 million on this, and the proposal passed. And so that was the decision. And so it's also, even though operating agreements don't have to be made public, generally, but if you end up in a dispute, they will be. You'll want to make it public so that the court or arbitrator can figure out, or again, even just amongst the members, right? If a member says, "Well, I gave you $100 and blah," whatever dispute, you got to have a document people can look at. And so whether that document is written in the traditional way, like an old-fashioned LLC, or leverages blockchain, that's the document that tells everyone how the organization works. And, over time, there's been some interesting, I think, incorrect criticism of legal entities where they say, well, if you have an operating agreement, how can you say you're decentralized? Because it's this one centralized document and it's filed with one government somewhere in the world, and one court somewhere will end up adjudicating any disputes. And while those things are technically true, if you write your operating agreement in a way that enforces decentralization, right, that guarantees rights and transparency for the members and decision making through certain smart contracts, and you can use it to guarantee and enforce decentralization, democratic decision making, whatever, transparency, whatever those things are that are important to your organization. And so in some ways, it's actually a way of even having even stronger decentralization than if you have no legal form, where there's nothing written down anywhere for a court or an arbitrator or a member to look at to know what's decentralized and what's not, or how decisions were supposed to be made. Those are some of the things. One other thing that comes up a lot is just, well, can you change the operating agreement? And of course you can. Anytime, get to your point, it's an agreement between the members. Those members can simply follow the process outlined in that agreement for changing it. And so that could be signing a document as a PDF. It could be doing a proposal on chain to amend the agreement. And so that's what allows people, for example, to go from having members tracked on paper at the beginning until they launch a token. So now you're getting that liability protection, et cetera. You launch your token, and now you amend the agreement so that token holders are members instead of people listed on the document. So those are some of the common things that come up for me. What else, Tatyana, do you see in terms of what questions come up, or what are some of the key issues that people have to think about when they're writing the agreement?
Right. So yeah, that comes up a lot. Can I change this? I tell clients that this is an evolving document. The important thing is to get registered right away, because if you want to take any actions, you want to have a clear governance structure and how decisions are made. For the example that you gave, like, hey, you're in court, how was this decision made? But also, just for how the DAO deals with other companies outside of itself. And what if a DAO wants to have a traditional bank account? So banks always ask for the constitutional or the founding documents and the operating agreements. And this is vital for that. Not all DAOs want regular bank accounts, but a lot of them do. So you have that as well. Yeah. And so it's evolving, and basically you don't have to constantly update it with MIDAO. You can update it within the procedures that are set forth in the agreement, like you said. And then every year in January, the DAO, when it goes through its annual filing procedures, just has to update the latest operating agreement as of December 31st of the year before. And that way there's always a newish version on the books. But then, as the year goes on, it can change, and that latest version can be, provided by the DAO itself. Yeah.
Cool. So we actually got one live question from YouTube that I want to just address briefly, and then we'll turn to the last topic for today. So the question is, and I guess I won't read the author's name in case they want to be anonymous, but the question is, USA-based DAOs can't raise funds like abroad DAOs. So can I do a USA DAO that owns a Marshall Islands DAO? And I'll give a more broad answer, I think, and then curious what you would say. We definitely see a lot of value in combining legal entities in creative ways or even simple ways to achieve your goals. So like we really commonly see something like a Delaware C Corp that's like a DevCo or OpCo or LabCo, and then a MIDAO, Marshall Islands DAO LLC for the overall project and community. Sometimes we even see a foundation in addition, and there's like 3 entities. And this can get a little bit expensive and complicated, but it can help you achieve goals such as, having an entity that's a more traditional VC investable entity like a Delaware C Corp, and then having an entity like the Marshall Islands DAO LLC that's better for launching tokens and giving governance rights to the community over collectively owned software or open source software, et cetera. We also see people having entities wholly owned by the DAO. I think that's more common. We may have had DAOs also wholly owned, DAO LLCs wholly owned by other companies, but I think especially we see the DAO LLC as the overall governance layer, and then maybe a subsidiary is a company somewhere else in the world that's used for some utility purpose. So what would you add to that, Tatyana?
I mean, just generally the flexibility that the Marshall Islands DAO LLC offers could give you, so many different configurations of how to set up your structure, it's so nice to have this entity as an option for your project, like just exactly what you were saying. If there's some reason why you need, very traditional established entity in the US or using a foundation somewhere, you can always have the Marshall Islands as like a governing DAO that's, has so much flexibility in this very, crypto friendly regulatory environment. So, yeah.
Cool. All right. Last topic for today. Let's address the recent Gabe Shapiro post. So, it's funny. I always wonder about someone like Gabe, who's a classic shit poster. And even on the same day, he posted this kind of negative tweet about MIDAO with some lies in it. There were other negative tweets about other people's projects. That said, I have no hard feelings if Gabe, he's working on an interesting project, and if he ever wanted to learn, what's really going on in the Marshall Islands and collaborate, we'd be open to that. But let's just address some of the falsehoods that he put down in his tweet. So he mentions that the MIDAO, he says these guys, MIDAO, charge projects a few $1,000s a year plus 3% of gross revenue to set up and maintain an entity for them. So first of all, let's just clarify that we do not charge any percent of gross revenue. So it is a few $1,000s a year, which is one of the best prices in the world for an offshore entity. The 3% gross revenue is a tax that applies only to for-profit DAO LLCs. So anyone who's looking at the nonprofit structures of the world, whether it's a Cayman Foundation, Panama Foundation, BVI, a 501c3 in the United States, actually is not as good, but similar. These are entities that are not taxed at all and have no pass-through taxes. LLCs, for-profit LLCs, anywhere in the world are taxed, either as pass-through entities and or with a tax of their own. And so, for example, the tweet also goes on to says, this entity is just an LLC. You can set up an LLC for $100 in Delaware or in Wyoming for $100. Well, those LLCs are completely pass-through entities for tax purposes. So all the taxes from a Delaware or Wyoming LLC or a DAO LLC will fall on the individual members and will be taxed as part of their personal income. So in the Marshall Islands, with the DAO for-profit DAO LLC, there is a 3% gross revenue tax. It does not apply to capital gains or dividends, and it goes directly to the government of the Marshall Islands. And there can be also pass-through tax implications. So any for-profit entity in the world, again, you're going to have taxes. It's not something that's unique to the Marshall Islands. That said, we are interested in helping the Marshall Islands move to a more modern tax regime that taxes profits instead of revenue. At the end of the day, the whole, but just to meet international standards, we'll probably make that change. So before I turn to the rest of the tweet, Tatyana, anything else you want to address so far?
Yeah, and I mean, most DAOs registering in the Marshall Islands are not for-profit DAOs. So he makes a big deal about, whoa, they're just like skimming 3% off the top of your, your earnings, and it's just simply not true. It actually is so much the fact that it's just a gross revenue tax of 3% and just on for-profit DAOs, that reduces the impact of that tax like significantly. Like, so I mean, that is the basis of his whole post. Like, oh, it's a legal scam. They're skimming this off. How can they get away with that? But I mean, it's just, it's totally uninformed and it's wrong, basically just wrong. And then on top of that, most LLC, DAO LLCs registered are nonprofits. Because of the flexibility and what we were just talking about, like, being able to use that structure, makes the nonprofit option very easy to use. And so a lot of them use it and then are tax exempt.
Yep. And I think the other part of this that's worth addressing is Gabe is recommending, US-based LLCs and as well as Panama and Cayman foundations. And we've already talked about the risks of being, based in the United States. I think many people all over the world, most people know that there are meaningful reasons why you might want to avoid basing your company in the US. And then he's recommending foundations, which have boards. Independent boards are much more expensive. I think most people in the world of DAOs would at least acknowledge that they might not want to have a board at some point, especially an independent director, someone that you're not only paying many thousands of dollars a year, but an independent person who gets to sign off on everything your DAO does. The DAO does a vote on chain. Now this person is deciding whether the DAO actually takes that action or not. I mean, it's so antithetical to how most people think about values in Web3 and values in DAOs. And so for a guy who's supposed to be a DAO or Web3 lawyer to be recommending foundations and US-based entities, I think just shows a bit of a lack of understanding of the values that are important to most people in the space.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little anecdote. I was just speaking at the Hawaii Blockchain Summit, and a founder came up to me afterwards and he said, wow, I wish I knew about the Marshall Islands DAO LLC. We have a Cayman Foundation and it's not even what we wanted. And it's costing us, $100,000 to set it up and maintain all the lawyer fees. So, and, just a lot of people came up and said similar things. So it is actually a legitimate, credible legal entity in a jurisdiction where there's a politically stable, government, and it's a sovereign nation, totally avoiding all the problems with U.S. jurisdiction. So yeah, Gabe gets a lot of things wrong with that post.
And that's the final note. He says, by the way, they, as in MIDAO, are not a law firm, so they do not even give legal advice as part of this. And that's absolutely true. We're not a law firm. That's why we have folks like Tatyana and literally hundreds of lawyers in our network of DAO-focused lawyers who are familiar with the Marshall Islands, who can provide legal advice to folks. And I'll just share my maybe spicy-ish take on that note from Gabe, which is that if you are going to hire a lawyer, maybe you should hire a lawyer who knows what he's talking about and has relevant and accurate information about DAO related legal entities somewhere in the world. So maybe don't hire Gabe, but do hire a lawyer to help you with your DAO or Web3 project.
Yeah. And to add on to that or pile on, what registered agent in the world is offering legal advice? None of them are.
It's not how it works.
Why would you expect them to? Of course, that's not what they're meant for. So
Yeah, totally.
you're not unique.
Yep. Awesome. All right. Well, Tatyana, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining the show. Any closing comments in terms of how people can find you on the web, on social? Anything else you want to share before we close?
Yeah. Happy to answer questions anytime. I'm really excited about MIDAO and all of the laws and amendments to come to make it just like the leading jurisdiction for registering DAOs. It's so exciting to see all these projects benefiting from this Marshall Islands DAO LLC entity. And yeah, I can be reached for any questions, to set anything straight that's been put out there that's confusing. I would love to talk about it. I can be reached on Telegram at DAO Lawyers. I'm also I'm on Farcaster, but I'm working into that. I have a website, DAOlawyer.xyz. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Yeah, that's
awesome.
it.
All right. And I think people know how to find me, so I'll skip it. But Tatyana, again, thank you so much. And for anyone in the audience, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it. Thanks, everyone.